Today marked the end of a three-day visit Chinese President Xi Jinping made to Moscow. Now, neither side seemed to change their position on Ukraine. In fact, according to reporters, Xi sought to maintain an impartial position with respect to the conflict. But regardless of what came out of the rendezvous, the United States has denounced the meeting from the get-go, a point that many foreign policy relations experts say could push China and Russia closer and closer.
Here to discuss how the U.S. could be missing an opportunity in this international relations game of chess is friend of the show, Trita Parsi, and Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. Welcome, Dr. Parsi.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you had written a piece recently that made the case that, China has gone out of its way to say things about how countries have to respect their territorial borders, a much more moderate position than some of the Western press might be framing it as having. But the fact of the U.S.'s posture is basically putting it in a position of needing to maintain good relationships with other global powers, given that the U.S. has been so kind of hawkish toward China of late. Can you unpack the kind of changing geopolitical dynamics that are happening here?
Yes, and again, thank you so much for having me. Look, things are changing in a very profound way. We have now China last week or the week before pulling off a normalization in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia. No one expected them to wanting to have the ambition of playing that role. Now we see the Chinese are in Moscow and stepping into potentially mediating between Russia and the Ukrainians. And the reaction from the U.S. side, or the traditional role of the U.S. to be able to be a peacemaker, seems to be something that we have given up the ambition of having. We are increasingly in conflict rather than being able to help bring conflicts to a close. And this is creating a space for the Chinese that could be quite problematic if the U.S. doesn't reassess the direction it is taking and the branding that it is now creating for itself in terms of states turning to China for mediation rather than looking towards the U.S. as a stabilizing force. I don't think per se that that's a bad thing for the world to have many peacemakers and others wanting to step up. I find it to be a bad thing if the U.S. steps down and no longer has the ambition to be able to play such a role.
Well, turning to the war in Ukraine, Dr. Parsi, last year you wrote an opinion piece for MSNBC in which you made the case that while Ukrainian President Zelensky did a masterful job in courting support from the West, he's been less convincing to nations in the global South like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and others. Walk us through how the U.S. played a role in keeping the global South from lending more support to Ukraine.
Well, I think that the U.S. has tried very hard to get other countries in the global South to support sanctions against Russia and joining in on what is now largely a Western effort to support Ukraine. It's just done so with an immense amount of tone deafness, which is part of the reason why it's been an utter failure. And it's not just a failure. I wrote that piece, I think, in April of last year, with a warning that we have to change tack if we want to be successful here. And I'm not seeing any significant effort. And part of the reason is because the U.S. and the Ukrainians were branding this, they were framing this as a fight for the rules-based order. Whereas in reality, in the eyes of a lot of countries around the world, the biggest threat to any order that is based on rules has been the conduct of the United States itself, with its endless wars, interventions, and putting itself above those rules. So if you want to get countries to make sacrifices, painful sacrifices, on behalf of the war effort in Ukraine, you have to frame it differently for something that they were actually willing to sacrifice for, because no one is going to lift much of a finger for this rules-based order. On the contrary, a lot of countries in the global South welcome a new world that is multipolar, in which they will remain close friends with the United States, but they want to have options to be able to balance the U.S. if the U.S. ends up acting recklessly, which unfortunately we have in the last decade. And that option is provided in a multipolar order that doesn't exist in a unipolar order. So why would they step up for that? If this was framed more along the lines of preventing aggression, standing up for the sovereignty of Ukraine, I think things could have ended up quite differently. But we were so drunk on our own Kool-Aid and thinking that this truly is a fight for the rules-based order and that we have the world behind us. And it's proven to be a mistake. And it's a mistake that we continue to conduct because we're not reassessing it in the manner that we should.
Well, Dr. Parsi, what do you make of the Western position on the ceasefire? The idea that to call for a ceasefire now is basically entrenching Russia's position and validating its territorial claims, basically stopping everything where it is in a way that advantages Russia. The countervailing view being that ceasefires are good things. It's good if Ukrainians are no longer literally in harm's way. How can America continue to participate, as you urged it to do, in the peace process if it seems to not be willing to accept any position other than full retrenchment from Russia back to the pre-February 2022 borders? Or do you agree that that's a position that the U.S. should be taking?
Well, my view is that, look, ceasefires can be good. Ceasefires can also backfire. But at the end of the day, what is our alternative? What are we putting forward as something that would be better? And the only thing we're talking about right now is a spring offensive by the Ukrainians that the White House apparently doesn't believe is going to change much on the ground. So we're going to have a lot of people dying, similar to the way it was in the First World War. A lot of fighting, a lot of dying, and the front lines are changing a couple of inches this direction or that direction. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think we also have to be clear that just starting diplomacy does not mean that the fighting automatically ends. We're treating the beginning of diplomacy as an automatic ceasefire. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Unfortunately, there's plenty of examples in which the sides are talking and fighting at the same time. So the question I have, why are we so afraid and opposed to the idea that while the war continues, forget about a ceasefire for a second, there actually would be ongoing diplomacy as well. And perhaps that diplomacy will lead to a breakthrough. Perhaps it will lead to a ceasefire that the U.S. also believes is beneficial. The other problem I have with the way that we're approaching this is that when the Ukrainians, for instance, cautiously welcomed the Chinese mediation, we did not. And we came out very strongly and said that the world should not be fooled by what the Chinese are trying to do, et cetera, et cetera. So it raises the question mark, why is it that we believe that Ukrainian agency should be absolutely central as long as they're pursuing war? But if the Ukrainians actually do want to move in the direction of a potential Chinese mediation, then we're against it. So what happens then to the agency? If the agency is central, it should be central not only when the Ukrainians are waging war, but also when they're pursuing peace. But we're very selective about it.
Absolutely. That would be totally consistent. So based on that hypocrisy on the U.S.'s part, is there a real fear that what the Biden administration's actual position is, forget what the Ukrainian position is, we don't care. What we actually want is to bleed Russia for as long as possible and, not have any compromise whatsoever, not give up a single inch of Russian territory, even if that means more people die, the war goes on, because really our ultimate goal is to just make Russia keep feeling the pain for having done this until and unless they give up entirely, which may never happen.
I have to say that, talking to European diplomats, one is oftentimes left with the impression that it is really not about the Ukrainians. It is about making sure that the Russians suffer as big of a defeat as possible, that they are essentially, in their view, sufficiently weakened before this war ends. And the ones who pay the price for it are the Ukrainian people with their blood. And we seem to be okay with it, because otherwise, in my view at least, the logic seems to fall apart as to why we are so worried about the initiation of diplomacy. Again, initiation of diplomacy is not automatically a ceasefire. So there seems to be a fear that the war would end prematurely, so to say. I don't like the use of language here, but nevertheless, prematurely before the Russians have been sufficiently weakened. And that the only way we actually can get a stable situation is not by being able to build an inclusive security arrangement and coexist, but we can only actually have a sustainable peace if the Russians are so weak that they cannot challenge that.
Dr. Parsi, we always appreciate you weighing in on these issues. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.